In the early 1980s, China stood at the precipice of transformation. The country was grappling with the devastating aftermath of decades under Mao Zedong's rule, marked by rigid policies that had left the nation economically crippled and socially fractured. Two key events, the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, had defined the Maoist era, plunging China into chaos, poverty, and underdevelopment. These events laid the foundation for the discontent and eventual uprising that would culminate in the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989. The Great Leap Forward, launched by Mao in 1958, was an ambitious yet catastrophic attempt to rapidly industrialize China and transform it from an agrarian society into a socialist paradise. The campaign forced millions of peasants into collective farms and encouraged small-scale industrial projects like backyard steel furnaces. But the reality was far from the utopian vision. Poor planning, unrealistic targets, and the diversion of labor from agriculture to industry led to economic disaster. The result was the Great Chinese Famine, where an estimated 15 to 45 million people perished due to starvation. This was not progress. It was a tragedy of unimaginable proportions. As if the wounds of the Great Leap Forward were not deep enough, Mao initiated the Cultural Revolution in 1966, a decade-long period of political and social upheaval designed to purge capitalist and traditional elements from Chinese society. Mao, fearing that the Communist Party was becoming too bureaucratic and that capitalist tendencies were re-emerging, mobilized the youth into groups known as the Red Guards. These young revolutionaries were encouraged to attack intellectuals, party officials, and anyone deemed counter-revolutionary. The Cultural Revolution targeted the four olds: old customs, culture, habits, and ideas, leading to the destruction of cultural artifacts, religious symbols, and historical sites. What followed was a decade of chaos. Public humiliations, imprisonment, torture, and executions became the order of the day. An entire generation was scarred as schools were closed, education was disrupted, and society was torn apart. By the time the Cultural Revolution ended in 1976 with Mao's death, China was left in ruins. The Maoist era had driven the nation into widespread poverty, inefficiency, and underdevelopment. The country was stagnant, its people disillusioned, and its future uncertain. This was the China that Deng Xiaoping inherited, a nation in desperate need of a new direction. The rise of Deng Xiaoping. In the aftermath of Mao's death, China found itself at a critical juncture. The nation was in desperate need of rejuvenation, and it was Deng Xiaoping who emerged as the leader capable of steering China in a new direction. Deng was pragmatic, shrewd, and focused on revitalizing China. He recognized that the old ways, rooted in strict socialist principles, had failed disastrously, and that China needed a fresh start if it was to reclaim its place on the world stage. Deng's strategy was revolutionary in its departure from Maoist ideology. He believed that China needed to open itself to global markets, embrace elements of capitalism, and adopt policies that had proven successful in other parts of the world. This approach was encapsulated in his famous saying, "It doesn't matter whether a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." Deng's vision for China prioritized practical results over ideological purity, marking the beginning of a new era for the country, one of economic reform and modernization. The decision to open China to global markets was driven by several key factors. After Mao's death, China was in a state of economic stagnation. The policies of the Maoist era had devastated the economy, leading to widespread poverty, inefficiency, and underdevelopment. The country needed a new direction to rejuvenate its economy. Deng and other Chinese leaders observed the success of market economies in the West and the rapid growth of neighboring countries like Japan and the four Asian tigers, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. They recognized that integrating with the global economy could be a pathway to economic prosperity. Deng Xiaoping was instrumental in pushing for these economic reforms. His pragmatic approach symbolized a shift from the rigid ideology of the past. Deng understood that China was technologically backward and lacked the capital needed to modernize its industries. Opening up to global markets was seen as a way to attract foreign investment, technology, and expertise that could accelerate economic growth. One of the first major reforms was the establishment of special economic zones, SEZs, in coastal cities like Shenzhen. These zones were given special tax incentives and a degree of economic autonomy to attract foreign investment. The success of the SEZs, particularly Shenzhen, became a model for the rest of the country and demonstrated the benefits of opening up to global trade and investment. The introduction of the household responsibility system in rural areas allowed farmers to lease land from the government and sell their surplus produce in the market after meeting state quotas. This incentivized productivity and led to a significant increase in agricultural output, lifting millions out of poverty. The government gradually decentralized economic decision-making, allowing local governments and enterprises more autonomy to make decisions based on market conditions. This shift allowed for more efficient allocation of resources and greater responsiveness to market demands. The opening up of China attracted significant foreign direct investment, particularly in manufacturing. Multinational companies were eager to tap into China's large labor force, and in return, China gained access to advanced technologies and management practices. This influx of capital and technology fueled rapid industrialization and modernization. China adopted an export-oriented growth strategy, becoming the world's factory. By focusing on manufacturing goods for export, China was able to generate substantial revenue, which was reinvested into infrastructure and other critical sectors, further driving economic growth. However, the benefits of these reforms were not evenly distributed. While economic reforms introduced market mechanisms, a significant portion of the economy remained under the control of state-owned enterprises, SOEs. These SOEs often had close ties to the Communist Party, and those with connections to the party were able to secure lucrative positions within these enterprises. As a result, they benefited disproportionately from the reforms. The rapid economic changes created opportunities for corruption and rent-seeking. Officials with connections to the party or to the leadership of SOEs were often able to leverage their positions to accumulate wealth, either through bribery, embezzlement, or by securing favorable contracts and deals. This exacerbated income inequality, as those without connections were left behind. The benefits of economic reforms were unevenly distributed across the country. Urban areas, particularly coastal cities, experienced rapid industrialization and wealth accumulation, while rural areas lagged behind. The rural population, which made up a significant portion of China, continued to face poverty and limited access to education and healthcare, further widening the gap between the rich and the poor. The reforms created new opportunities for entrepreneurship and investment, but those who already had access to capital, education, and connections were in a better position to take advantage of these opportunities. The majority of the population, however, did not have access to these resources, leading to increased inequality as the wealthy elite grew richer. These factors combined to create a situation where the benefits of China's economic reforms were not evenly distributed, leading to significant disparities between different segments of the population. This inequality, along with the suppression of dissent and corruption, fueled the discontent that ultimately led to the events in Tiananmen Square in 1989. The death that fueled the massacre. As China grappled with the consequences of its economic reforms, a key event triggered the wave of unrest that would culminate in the Tiananmen Square protests. On April 15, 1989, Hu Yaobang, a former General Secretary of the Communist Party of China, passed away from a heart attack. Hu was more than just a political figure. He was seen as a reformist leader who advocated for greater political openness and tolerance of dissent. His sudden death from a heart attack triggered an outpouring of grief among students and intellectuals who viewed him as a symbol of political liberalization. Hu's legacy was complex. He had been ousted from power in 1987, largely due to his lenient stance on student protests, which had made him a target for hardliners within the party. His death, therefore, was seen not just as the loss of a reformist leader, but as the death of the hopes for political change that he had embodied. In the days following his death, thousands of students began gathering in Tiananmen Square in Beijing to mourn Hu and demand greater political freedoms, such as freedom of speech and an end to government corruption. What started as a spontaneous expression of grief quickly grew into something much larger. The students, many of whom had been frustrated by the lack of political freedoms and the widespread corruption they saw around them, began to use the occasion to voice their demands for political reform. Their initial mourning turned into a call for greater political openness, freedom of speech, and an end to government corruption. Rising tensions. The mourning period for Hu Yaobang soon evolved into a broader movement. The student gatherings in Tiananmen Square attracted attention and support from a wide range of people, including intellectuals, workers, and ordinary citizens, who were disillusioned with the government's failures to address the growing economic inequalities and political repression. By late April, what began as a small gathering had swelled into a massive demonstration, with thousands of people converging on Tiananmen Square daily. As people across the country were inspired by the courage of the Beijing students and began to voice their own frustrations, the protesters' demands expanded to include calls for press freedom, government accountability, and the end of nepotism and corruption within the Communist Party. The growing movement became a direct challenge to the Chinese government, which was increasingly alarmed by the scale of the dissent. The Chinese government's initial response was one of caution. Premier Li Peng and other leaders attempted to engage with the protesters, holding meetings with student representatives in the hopes of diffusing the situation. However, these talks failed to produce any meaningful resolution, as the protesters remained steadfast in their demands for genuine political reform, which the government was unwilling to concede. As the protests gained momentum, tensions continued to rise. On May 13, 1989, in an effort to escalate their demands and draw further attention to their cause, student leaders began a hunger strike in Tiananmen Square. This act of defiance garnered widespread public sympathy and international media attention, further pressuring the Chinese government to respond. The turning point. The Chinese leadership was deeply divided on how to handle the escalating situation. Some advocated for continued negotiation and patience, hoping that the protests would eventually lose steam. Others, particularly hardline elements within the Communist Party, saw the protests as an existential threat to the party's authority and believed that a show of force was necessary to quell the unrest. Ultimately, the hardliners won out. On May 20, 1989, the Chinese government declared martial law in Beijing, signaling its intention to take more drastic measures to restore order. The People's Liberation Army was mobilized, and thousands of troops, along with tanks and other military vehicles, were sent into the city. The Tiananmen Square massacre. Despite the imposition of martial law, the protesters remained defiant, continuing to occupy Tiananmen Square and refusing to back down. The situation reached a tragic and bloody climax on the night of June 3 to 4, 1989. With the protests showing no sign of abating, the Chinese leadership made the decision to use force to clear Tiananmen Square. Late that night, People's Liberation Army troops, supported by tanks and armored vehicles, moved into the square to disperse the demonstrators. The crackdown was brutal. Soldiers fired live ammunition into the crowds, and tanks rolled over makeshift barricades erected by the protesters. The exact number of casualties remains unknown, as the Chinese government has never released an official death toll. Estimates vary widely, with some reports suggesting that several hundred people were killed, while others put the number at several thousand. The violence was not confined to Tiananmen Square. Throughout Beijing, troops clashed with civilians, leading to further bloodshed. The crackdown effectively ended the protests, but the cost in human lives was immense. By the morning of June 4th, the square had been cleared, and the Chinese government had reasserted its control over the capital. The world watched in horror as the images and reports of the massacre began to emerge, but within China, the government moved swiftly to suppress any information about the events of that night. The man who defied the government. The aftermath of the massacre, the morning of June 5, 1989, provided the world with one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. A lone man standing defiantly in front of a column of tanks on Chang'an Avenue near Tiananmen Square. This man, who would come to be known as Tankman, became a symbol of individual resistance against authoritarianism. Dressed in a simple white shirt and holding 2 shopping bags, Tankman blocked the path of the lead tank, refusing to move as the vehicle tried to maneuver around him. The standoff lasted several minutes, during which Tankman even climbed onto the tank to speak to the crew inside. The image of this solitary figure standing up to the might of the Chinese military captured the imagination of people around the world, becoming a powerful symbol of the struggle for freedom and human rights. Tankman's identity and fate remain unknown. After he was pulled away from the tanks by 2 unknown individuals, he disappeared into the crowd, and no definitive information has ever surfaced about who he was or what happened to him. Some have speculated that he was a student named Wang Weilin, but the Chinese authorities have denied having any information about him. Tankman remains a mystery, a haunting reminder of the courage it takes to stand up to oppression. The legacy. In the days and weeks following the massacre, the Chinese government moved quickly to suppress any memory of the protests and the violence that had been used to end them. Martial law remained in place in Beijing for some time, and a nationwide campaign was launched to arrest and punish those involved in the demonstrations. Many protesters, activists, and intellectuals were detained, some were executed, and others were forced into hiding or exile. The Chinese government also implemented strict censorship to erase any mention of the Tiananmen Square protests from public discourse. Media coverage of the massacre was heavily controlled, and references to the events were removed from textbooks and other educational materials. The government worked to ensure that future generations would remain ignorant of the protests and the brutal crackdown that followed. To this day, the Chinese government maintains tight control over information about the Tiananmen Square massacre. The topic remains taboo in China, with any discussion of the events of June 1989 subject to censorship and punishment. Despite this, the legacy of Tiananmen Square continues to resonate around the world, serving as a powerful symbol of the struggle for freedom and the lengths to which governments will go to maintain their grip on power. The story of Tiananmen Square, from the early economic reforms to the tragic events of June 1989, is a story of hope, resistance, and ultimately, brutal repression. The protests were born out of the desire for a better, more just society, but they were met with the full force of an authoritarian state determined to maintain its control at any cost. The legacy of those who stood up for their beliefs, and of Tankman, who stood alone against the might of the Chinese military, continues to inspire those who fight for freedom and human rights around the world.